Hello, Robs. We're back with A Mother in History. Marguerite Oswald, the mother of the man who killed Kennedy, by Jean Stafford. We will pick up at page 60. Let's see where we left off. Against Me, that's where it was. I used to work in Algiers, Louisiana, during the war, and that is across the river from New Orleans. I was a switchboard operator. My duty was 6 o'clock in the morning until 3 or 6:30. I forget which. So I rented the room in Algiers, Louisiana, and my sister was taking care of Lee permanently at this particular time. He was about 2 years old. Every evening I left Algiers and took the ferry and came over and took care of my baby, and would have to leave early enough to get home before dark. After all, I was a woman alone to be across the river so I could go to work for 6:30. And the naval base personnel used to come with the jeep to pick me up because there was no other way to get to the naval base. Well, this was typical of most of my life. It's a little humorous in a way, but it's typical of things that have happened to me right along. I was on this side of New Orleans, and this young lady that also roomed where I was rooming had a car, and she was coming to New Orleans, and she told me that if I would stay over, she would take me home. Well, my two nephews had had a tonsillitis operation, and I went to the hospital and stayed a little while with them, and then I met this young lady, and she had a date, and they decided that we should go into one of the nightclubs in Vieux Carré and have a little recreation. Well, now I love to dance and go out to dinner and places like that, and so I said I would. And before I knew it, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. What could I do? I'm with them. They leave, they have the car, so I have to wait. So when I did get home, I called the other young lady who worked the evening shift for the switchboard and told her I wasn't feeling well, and would she take the morning and I would take the evening. She said she would, however, it didn't please her too much. So that afternoon, I was called to the colonel's office, and he asked me what happened. And I told him I wasn't feeling well and that I had been up until late and had been to the hospital. That part of the course was true. So it was perfectly natural that I called the other young lady and asked her to change with me. However, I did dance, you see, with a few of the boys, and they happened to be men from the base. But now, how was I to know that? And he told me that I was not telling the truth and I had been seen in a nightclub and I was dancing until 2 o'clock in the morning when I should have been home in bed resting to be there for the 6 o'clock shift, and he fired me right then and there. She allowed the climax to remain frozen for a moment before she rang the curtain down to, to point the moral. This is just a little story that shows what goes on in my life. I was fired right on the spot. When I think of all the things that are being said about me, I think about all these things that have happened, and there must be a simple explanation for them. It is my job to find that explanation for all the inaccuracies and distortions and so on and so forth so that the people will understand. I asked only one more question that day, and I did so with trepidation. I asked if she had voted in the last presidential election. She bridled, but her outrage was put on like a false nose. She said, "Why, honey? You know I can't discuss my personal politics. After all, I am responsible for two presidents." She took off the nose and meandered on. She bemoaned the loss of mementos of Lee. Lee was a beautiful child, and this is why I gave all the pictures of him to the magazines. I got rooked financially, but that was all right because they showed a nice clean boy and a boy not underfed. But I don't have many mementos for this reason. When Lee and Marina returned from Russia, I did as I did with the other boys as soon as they were married. I gave Lee his baby book and things of all that kind, and Marina has them all now and refuses to give them to me. I gave Lee a watch that belonged to his father, but that was in my possession for years and years and years. It was a pocket watch, and my husband was called after the General Robert E. Lee, but he was always called Lee. You see, my first son by Mr. Oswald is named Robert E. Lee, and then Lee is called Lee. When Lee was born, that is, Lee Harvey Oswald, I never could say the name Lee because my husband was always called Lee. Am I making it plain? No, but go on. He was really named after the general, so I kept the watch for Lee. I had it all those years, and then I gave it to Lee when he returned from Russia. I feel like these things are mine, and I want them, but I have been very unsuccessful in getting them back. Also, there's a little navy blue wool suit that the three boys wore, and I have carried that around for over 26 years, and it didn't even have a moth hole in it. It was an adorable little suit. Pardon it. Scratch my nose. Lee's picture in life evolution of an assassin at 6 months has the suit on, and I gave it to my daughter-in-law, Robert's wife, just about 3 months before the assassination because I was nursing and moving around, and I asked her to keep it for me, and this has not been returned to me. Actually, I've suffered a great deal. The refrain, enunciating travail, came off with her customary unwavering matter-of-factness. Among her souvenirs of Lee, Mrs. Oswald did still have a little replica of a Magnus organ that I bought him while we were in New York for Christmas 1953. I paid approximately $39.95 for it. This and other properties to whose sentimental value had been added to a historic dimension she kept in storage. She spoke of letters she had written to prominent people when Lee was in Russia. Here's a young boy, and let's say he was adventurous or anything about him, but anyhow, he was in Russia trying to renounce his citizenship. Instead of blasting him on the front pages, why didn't they get together and see that he came home to his native land? I sent a telegram to the mayor of Fort Worth, but I didn't receive an answer. I wrote to Sam Rayburn and to Christian Herder. I wonder what become of those letters. I don't know if that's supposed to be that way or if it's an error. Who knows? I also wrote to Mr. Khrushchev, July 19th, 1960. I stated that Lee had gone to Russia. It's September of 1959 that I had one letter from him in January, but my letter to him was returned and I never heard from him again. I asked Mr. Khrushchev to supply me with any information about his whereabouts, if he was working and so on and so forth. I said that I was much worried and deeply concerned, as a mother would be. Now, I did not receive an answer from Mr. Khrushchev, and this brings up another interesting aspect of the case. The letter to Christian Herder and the letter to Sam Rayburn and the letter to Congressman Jim White all expressed the same thing. I said from what I had read in the newspaper, my son said that he wanted to live in a communist country, in a working man's country because of the communists here and hate and racial discrimination and everything. And I made it perfectly plain that as an individual, even though he was young, he had served in the Marines and he had become an adult, not in age, but in maturity because of his hitch in the Marines. And as an individual, if this was what he wanted to do, I in no way wanted to influence him because I thought he had a right to his own life. And this I believe. Yet Representative Ford had a big article in Life magazine about Mother's myth, son and agent, and he must have, or he should have, known that I in no way wanted to influence my son to come home. He said that I went to Washington in 1961, which I did. I was in dire need, which I was, but I went to petition President Kennedy to get my son to come home in order to support and help me, not to influence him. What an injustice to a mother. In the most abrupt and perfunctory parenthesis possible, she said that it was time for more iced tea. And, raising her voice about the chattering of the ice cubes as she briskly stirred our glasses of strange brew, she lectured and invoked and apostrophized without transition, and with a grand if confounding disregard for chronology. Immediately after she had served up Representative Ford's head on a platter, she took the Secret Service to task. The Secret Service would not let me get near my daughter-in-law. I fought and fought like a wild animal. I called the head of the Secret Service, I guess every day, begging to see my daughter-in-law, and they wouldn't let me get near her. So she changed her testimony. First it was Lee was good man, Lee no do nothing, Lee no kill nobody. And then I was pushed out, absolutely pushed out, and Marina Oswald's husband was a louse. Now I arrived in Dallas on March the 9th, at the height of the Ruby trial, and was told by reporters and I can verify this, that Mrs. Payne was in Marina's house. But the point I'm going to make and make strongly is that I do not think it was fair that Mrs. Payne spoke with Marina Oswald before Mrs. Payne herself testified. Now, I didn't have that opportunity or my sons. I had never talked to John Edward or Robert or Marina or vice versa, so no one in the close family knew what each other was going to say. And this is very sad because we could have understood each other a little better rather than bog each other down as it came out sometime. But Mrs. Payne did have that privilege to talk to my daughter-in-law, and this I don't like. This I don't like one bit. Why do the Secret Service let this strange woman see my daughter-in-law and not me? But the Secret Service never questioned me, nor the FBI either. The Secret Service and the FBI never came near me. But you have been interviewed, I said, because there had flashed before my inward eye newspaper stories about her without number. Oh, yes, of course I've been interviewed by the newspapers, if that's what you mean, she said crossly, still put out by having been given the cold shoulder by the FBI and the Secret Services. I've been interviewed by them by the galore. Now, let me give you an instance of how I hold a lot of these cards that will show up. The inaccuracies and the errors about the diary. You asked about that. I had not asked about the diary. In fact, I had forgotten its existence. Possibly the question had come from someone nearer the front of the house. It has never been verified how the diary was leaked. It said in one article that no one knew where the diary came from, but a certain reporter in Dallas interviewed the widow, Mrs. Marina, quite often, so it implied that this is where the diary came from, and he refused to release where it came from, but she and her attorney expressed indignation about the release of the diary and so on, and they sent telegrams to the Warren Commission saying they didn't think it was right, and the Warren Commission was going to investigate, and the FBI. So I just sat and watched. I smiled inwardly quite a bit when I read about myself. I smile and say, oh goodness, how could you be so wrong? Only way I can survive to have a little sense of humor. So I was smiling and waiting. This is good. All this, the FBI is going to check, I'm waiting and waiting, but no one came. So after the third day, I called the FBI, which is in Dallas, and I forget the man's name, and I told him who I was, and I said, I have been waiting for someone to come over and question me about the release of the so-called diary, and nobody has. And he said, well, do you have the diary, Ms. Oswald? And I said, no, I don't, but I just can't imagine all the fuss about the diary and not coming and asking if I released the diary, he said. Oh, diary. He said, they didn't come because they knew you didn't have it. And I said, yes, they know I didn't have it because they released it themselves. Now, do you get an idea of what I'm talking about? Why, this just insults my intelligence. For 1 second, I was carried back in time to a winter when I had been a student at the University of Heidelberg. One afternoon, an American friend and I were moseying through Woolworths on the Hauptstrasse. We found this a good way to pick up the German words for miscellaneous hardware when we saw a Japanese student at the stationery counter having a plainly fruitless conversation with the clerk. My friend Hightower, now a distinguished sinologist at Harvard, had a smattering of Japanese and was as much impelled, I think, to show it off as he was to do a good turn. The Japanese was grateful. He had wanted gummed reinforcements for his loose-leaf notebook, and we fell into a ridiculous conversation. All of us had a little German. The Japanese had a few snippets of English, about as many as Hightower had of Japanese. Our communication, for some reason, seemed to us worthy and charming, and we continued it out to the street and into a conditori, where we became fast friends before we had finished our coffee. After that, for several months, Hal Hightower and I met once or twice a week, and together we read Ulysses, holding the text in 3 languages. At any rate, it seems to me we did. I dare say we tried it once and gave up. Somehow the snap went all out of Joyce's puns when we tried them on in German and Japanese. What little German we had diminished and grew deformed, and we began to forget our own languages. We remained friends, but I think that when we met for coffee, we read to ourselves and simply smiled at one another from time to time. Mrs. Oswald's conversation with the FBI man about the diary left me in just about as deep water as I had been in when I had tried to understand Hightower's elucidation in German of Joyce's play on metempsychosis to hell. You see, they have never questioned me about one thing, she went on. What I'm trying to say is that the normal thing is they should have been at my door right away. I could have had the diary. It was my son's diary, but I was never questioned. So the proof of the pudding is that they knew it was absolutely leaked and they let it die down. You didn't hear any more about it. You see, that is a good example because I could have had the diary. If they were sincere, they would have come to me. Let's face it. One and one just don't make two. My book is going to be called One and One Don't Make Two or this and that. They're concerning they're concerned about the diary and everybody's investigating, but nobody comes and asks this old mother if she had the diary and she released it. So I never believed that it was my son's diary. I grew increasingly muddled as she escorted me down cul-de-sacs and through words which significantly she felt could not be seen for the trees, as various as the terra, or is it terra incognite, or the points of time at which we traversed them. Sometimes I was in New Orleans listening to Lee as he sang Silent Night with a nice little voice. But at the next moment, I was at the Six Flags Motel with the Madame Marguerite and Marina Oswald after the boy's murder. And Johnny on the Spot, Life magazine, was there infiltrating the ranks of Corps. I examined the contents of Lee's sea bag. When he came back from Formosa, he carried with him a book of Christmas carols and a Christmas card from his mother, which she had sent him in 1956. I went to Washington with her to the hearings before the Warren Commission and stayed in a suite of rooms, the size of a house, dining room, grand piano, everything. I was haunted by the spectral figures of unnamed Secret Service men with a lot of accounting to do, the FBI men who had stayed away from her door, high officials who blew their tops when Mrs. Oswald asked them direct questions. I saw a copy of the letter written to Khrushchev. She keeps a copy of everything she writes. I saw a Mother's Day card signed Lee that had come from Russia in 1960, and I saw the subpoena requiring her to appear instanter at the Ruby trial. Sheer perseverance had won her this peremptory invitation. She had been barred from the courtrooms. Courtroom. The tapes were finally used up, and the ashtray beside me was full of cigarette stubs. We stood up, and both of us stretched like women who had done a hard day's work cleaning out the cellar and putting up rhubarb. The room was disheveled with exhibits, and the furniture was still out of place where we had moved it to accommodate the tape recorders. I offered to help Miss Oswald tidy up, but she said, no, I don't have another thing to do. I was hoping I could give you a bite of supper, but I suppose you can't stay. No, I can't, I said. I'm sorry. She laughed. If you can't, you can't. She said, parodying a broad A that does not exist in my speech. You go on back to Dallas now and you be fresh for tomorrow because we still got a lot to talk about here. Tomorrow. She was struck with a numbing thought. Tomorrow is Mother's Day, and I will go to Lee Harvey Oswald's grave. But I will be a mother alone, a mother in history alone on Mother's Day. A vaporing cloak of wistfulness enveloped her, for no longer than the twinkling of an eye. Resourceful woman, she found a dandy solution to her dilemma, and gaily, as if she were planning a picnic or a frisk through an amusement park, she said, I know, I'll take you. I'll be honest, Jean Stafford is kind of a bitch. I don't like her at all. I mean, not only is she using this woman for fodder and exploiting her, but she's a snarky bitch in the process. Don't like the woman. Don't like her, bro. It's one thing to not like Marguerite Oswald and to write a non emotionally involved story, but this is kind of just rubbish. Just tabloid fodder bullshit. It's kind of embarrassing. It's embarrassing. All right, that's all. Goodbye.